Blog Talk Radio.
Good morning. This is your host, Llorraine Neithardt. You have reached Venus Unplugged, and what we do at this half-an-hour talk is all about Venus, the archetype, how she operates in our life, the principle of love. We work with myth and dreams and fairy tales and all things Venusian, the good, the bad, and Venus has a way of, her revengers are very original and creative. And we all know the pangs of loving, or what we believe is love, but as we mature and grow and ask questions and suffer. So today we are continuing our talk on suffering. And this inspiration comes from Helen Luke. Helen Luke was a very fine Jungian therapist, probably one of the few individuated persons. We hear that word bantered around a lot, individuation, wholeness, but not a lot of examples. And this woman is an example. So anybody who's interested in following up in any of her work, please do. It is a absolute divine love and truth for your soul. She speaks and writes so beautifully and so precisely. So we're working with that. And we want to also remind you that the word archetype is a Jungian term, although he didn't invent it. It was around for a long time. So when we talk about archetypal forces, within the archetype, within a complex or within the archetype, depending on which archetype it is, it could be the mother, it could be the trickster, or varies. There is always a divinity. There is a god or goddess, force, memory, principle within that archetype. So when we start poking the archetype, if we know our mythology or we know the nature of these beings, we can kind of get a little bit of a red thread to what we're really dealing with. So this suffering also has to do with the difference between neurotic suffering, where we're just like, yeah, and turning it into meaning, which means we've kind of have to eat the shadow. We have to look at it and say, okay, I'm going to allow this. Let's say you had an argument with somebody. Of course we want to be right. Of course we always are right. Until in the middle of the night we wake up and we ask ourselves a question. Is it worth it to be right? Is it righteous? Or is there a little touch of shadow in here that I've got to look at? And perhaps, just perhaps, that can turn to gold. It's not about right or wrong. When we get into that conversation of right or wrong or inner speak, we have to have the tension of the opposite. It is neither right nor wrong. It is, what is it that we're refusing to suffer? So in last week's talk, we went through this first part. Now, here's what she says. However great our efforts may be to achieve the conscious attitude to suffering, we cannot succeed without an awareness that, in spite of its apparent senselessness, there is always an implicit universal meaning, even in the carrying of a small misery. Every time a person exchanges neurotic depression for real suffering, he or she is sharing to some small degree the carrying of the suffering of mankind and bearing a tiny part of the darkness of the world. Such a one is released from his small personal concern into a sense of meaning. One may be consciously thinking in those terms, but the transition can immediately be recognized by the disappearance of the frustrated pointlessness of mood and depression. Where do all moods go? Where do all problems go? That's always, it's like where they go, old baggage goes, okay? Lost baggage goes someplace, gets transformed. But when it suddenly disappears, it means we're out of the complex. We're not momentarily possessed by an archetype. When we go on and on and on with an issue and we can't stop it, you're having an archetypal seizure. Just know that much. And just, if you can, just step back a little bit and listen to it. Don't agree with it. Don't do what it says, but listen to it. Wow. This is fascinating. See, but once we get in it, it's a runaway train. So we may emotionally move and we may be emotionally moved and filled with honor and pity when we hear of the tragedies of the human lives at a distance. But the emotion lifts no burden. They carry nothing. In contrast, the smallest consent to the fierce, sharp pain of objective suffering is in the most trivial seeming matter may have an influence. As the Chinese sage puts it, at a distance of 1,000 miles, we may be entirely certain that the burden somewhere is lightened by our effort. There is a familiar example of the difference between objective suffering and subjective emotional reaction and its effects to others, which may have people experience at some time in their lives if they have been seriously ill. A nurse or anyone who is close to another's pain, physical or psychic, if she reacts with intense personal emotion to the participant's misery, will either repress what she cannot bear or become hard and unfeeling, or else will increase the sick one's burden through her unconscious identification. A true nurse, by contrast, is always deeply concerned. She is compassionate, which means objectively suffering with, but not invaded by emotional reactions. She herself is changed by the experience through the love that lives beyond emotion. The love that lives beyond emotion. That's Venus. The patient can literally be saved by this kind of carrying by another, but can be swamped and pushed deeper into misery by the unconscious reactions to those around him or her, however well they may be disguised. The difference is subtle, but absolutely distinct when experienced. That's why at times when you're suffering, you don't want to tell certain people because it turns into like a three-ring circus, and it's like, whoa, completely unrelated. And then you're more frustrated because it's something that can't be shared or held. Some great tragedy that is very, very private. If you tell someone who doesn't know how to hold that pain, and just listen, but not identify, when they go off and like, oh yeah, that happened to me once. It's like, what the heck does that have to do with what's going on with me bleeding out right now? So we want to try this conscious suffering, not repression, but to know this causes suffering. I will carry this, but I will not identify with it. And it's so far-reaching, which is what the whole point of consciousness is. As each person individuates and learns to work with their own shadow, their own unconscious behavior, that's the only thing towards world peace that can make any difference. That's what goes on. So, just as there is no cure for inferior kinds of love except a greater and more conscious love, so there is no cure for inferior so-called suffering except a greater kind of suffering. It is possible by the intense conscious attention to pass through this door into the fierce suffering which is linked to the whole. Then a strange thing may happen. We have lifted the weight, and instead of being crushed by it, we find it extraordinary light. The pain remains, but it is more like the piercing of a sword than a weight. A sword shall pierce through thy own soul also, that the thoughts of the many hearers may be revealed. These are prophetic words. And what that is saying is, by consciously knowing and not reacting, we're going to get an insight. And very often with that insight is a gift. And what is the greatest gift than having a sense of wholeness and not getting caught up in the dynamics of the world that have nothing to do with us or our own. The neurotic people refuse to suffer. They just run around the water hole like little chihuahuas barking. But jump in the hole. Get wet. Go into the mud. Go into the underworld. Find out what's going there. But neurotic people refuse to suffer, and they drop the suffering on other people. And they can be very sophisticated about it. All right? Or spiritual about it. Well, all is good, so I'm not suffering. Watch out. Step away. Because the suffering is part of what makes us human. We have a heart. We feel for others, but not identify. And here she says something very interesting, and I find this to be absolutely true. There is in man a fear of joy as seen as the fear of suffering pain, because true joy precludes the pleasant feeling of self-importance, just as suffering precludes all the comforts of self-pity. Man, that's a mouthful, right? No man can know the one without the other. It is important here to discriminate between the two, the joy and the martyr complex, and the joy which is on the other side of the cross. She's talking here about the crucifixion. All right. Real suffering belongs to innocence, not guilt. Real suffering belongs to innocence, not guilt. As long as we feel misery because we are full of remorse and guilt or shame over our weaknesses, all we experience is a loss of vital energy and no transformation takes place. Because that's what we're going for, the transformation. Make it conscious, which is always suffering. It's suffering because it's also a loss for the ego. The ego always wants to be right. And the second adulthood, as they call it, there's a lot of loss of ego because it can't carry the soul. It has to serve the soul. And that's what is talked about with this innocence. But the minute we accept objectively the guilt or shame, the innocent part of us begins to suffer. The weight becomes a sword. We bleed, and the energy flows back into us on a deeper and more conscious level. This is the real repentance as opposed to ego-centered shame, for it involves the recognition of the true guilt, which is always in our evasion of objective awareness. So that's a very important thing to observe. Why is it so important to be right when it can be true? When it could go back into psyche, back into your soul, back into your unconscious with an insight, with knowing, with acceptance of our own folly, and deeply feeling that. Next time you won't be tricked when you get set up, or somebody wants to involve you in their neurotic performance piece. You're going, nah, I suffered that enough. I've suffered to that folly. I'm not going for that one. And you just observe. Or something comes up, a heartbreak. We look at it. What is the true suffering? Do I have to give up some self-pity because that person couldn't love me, or was it meant to love me, and I have to accept that? Or that the love has served its purpose and we need to move away, or that I served as the enemy for that person to grow, that's a big one. If we can observe that, like, wow, so I got the starring role in their drama. So you're not going to fight for your innocence. You suffer knowing that you're suffering. But then it goes away. And when it comes back as insight. That's maturity. We don't have a big movement. We all want to be spiritual, but nobody wants to be mature. Be mature. And that's the deepening. And, one of the things that Jung said was that we also can outgrow complexes. There are things we do outgrow. So here's to outgrowing. So in these days when the media brings us to the daily sight and sound of appalling suffering of the innocent, we all have a great need of reminders of the way in which we can contribute to the healing and the terrible split between curse and blessing in our time. The split between curse and blessing. The poets and great storytellers of all ages come to our aid. When one man takes up responsibility for his blindness without any false guilt, even the smallest things, the self-pity and the projections of blame onto others or onto God drop away. The projections onto God. Now, God is not a person. It's not personal. The word God is the atmosphere of divinity. So God is always us, too. We're in that atmosphere. So here we have it that, so when we blame others or we try to project onto God, it drops away, and the blessing beyond the opposites is strengthened in our environment. It seems infinitesimal, but in Jung's words, it may be making weight the tips of the scale. Thus we suffer the sword objectively, refusing nothing, so that the healing may reach the hearts of many, without our conscious intention. It happens not through our willed effort to improve the world, fine and right, though this may be on another level, but to the degree to which the curse and the blessing have been experienced consciously as one in the psyche of the individual. It is an experience which C.G. Jung writes about in Mysterium Conjunctus. That's a now chemical book, okay? And where he says the individual in stillness, the individual who constitutes the meaning of the world. We begin by defining a word. We end with another word, passion, derived from the Latin word passino, meaning suffering. It is used to being defined as the suffering of Christ. Commonly, the word applies to any emotion which goes beyond the bounds of reason, consuming and possessing a man so that he is in a state of enthusiasm, which, in its original meaning, is a state of being filled with God, whether the God of anger, whether the God of love, or whether the God of hate, which I think is so interesting, because people will say God, and it's like, well, which one? Which archetype? Because the divine is everything. And so you have it on the highest, my God tells me. Well, are you channeling the God of hate? It's God. And you feel that you're right. But it's not the one of love. It's not the one of integration. It's one-sided. So when the suffering breaks through the small personal content and exposes a man to the pain and darkness of life itself, the way is open to the ultimate statue of passion, beyond all passions of desire. There may be a completely emptying, and in that emptying, we find ourselves. Many years ago was my spiritual teacher. For 7 years, I worked on the esoteric arts and was a discipline of those, okay, and then for the last 25 years, the work of the Jungian, which was a wonderful combination for my gift of clairvoyancy. But my spiritual teacher, and of course I was so young and neurotic, I suppose, she would say, if you really work on consciousness and you really work on your wholeness, you'll heal 7 generations to come and 7 generations in the past. I thought, what? What a burden. And plus, I'm clueless. I don't know how to do that. But then over the years, you begin to realize that your influence, the conversations you have, the people in your family, they know that you're interested in something. They start to ask questions. They start to change. You start to change. So it is true. So when we take up, and very often are chosen, and that is usually a pretty traumatic experience, to be chosen to become conscious, because the ego doesn't like that. Always wants to be right. And so when we're choosing consciousness, when we're choosing love, that doesn't mean pity and sympathy. That means really taking it down and on and through. And, where was I? What was I doing? What was I thinking? It's like realizing fear is an inverted aggression. So when we're feeling fear, we then have to go like, okay, well, what's my aggression? What do I really, really want to do? But I'm choosing fear because the aggression is too scary. So, when we look at that, when the fear comes up, whether it could be a fear of being wrong. It could be, any number of fears. I mean, pick a fear. It's always waiting for you, all right? So fear is this aggressivity in reverse. So consequently, the thing we are afraid of involves the next task. The thing we are afraid of involves the next task. Let's say you fear that you're unlovable. Well, you know what? Then the next task is self-love. How may I treat myself in an honorable and lovable way? How can I find that orphan child within and mother it, love it, no matter what? That's the next task. So, or if you're afraid of your own thoughts, well, then that's your next task. What are you thinking and why are you thinking that? What is taking place? Or how are you participating in keeping another infantile by either agreeing with them or pandering, not allowing the person to suffer? Because it is a suffering. Consciousness is a conscious suffering. What are we suffering? We're suffering that we're not right. Who cares about being right? Or we're suffering to, it's almost like the diamond or the pearl is suffering to become a pearl. A pearl is created from a piece of sand in the oyster, aggravates it, and then the coating that the oyster creates becomes the pearl. Hence the pearl of great price. And the pearl is also a symbol of the self with a capital S. So that one pearl, or meditate on a pearl, whether it be a picture of a pearl or a real pearl, and really what that pearl went to have that beauty and that gift from the sea. Gifts from the sea always represents the unconscious. So when we begin to recognize, and a lot of times it's through our fear, which is reversed. We're really feeling aggressive, but we choose fear instead. And then we do the blame game. which is useless. The second you can catch yourself in that, believe me, it is gold. What are we blaming? Write it out. Do active imagination. Active imagination is one side communicates with the other. We write it down. And then we see the difference. And then we realize, like, wow, two things are always happening. Because the whole gig is about individuation, which is the coming together of the opposites. You don't choose either one. You choose wholeness, and then out of that comes wisdom. Because as you can trust yourself to be fair with yourself, fair, loving, being able to say, okay, I spoke from a complex. Where, you know, when you feel beside yourself, well, who do you think that is? That's the complex. The complex are within us, but they're also around us. The divine is in us. It's also around us. Venus is definitely there, although very often the society banishes her. And one day I'll talk about my work on the crucified Venus, which is what I call it. It's how we fear beauty. We banish her. We won't choose the beautiful thing. We'll choose the neurotic suffering instead of calling in the beauty or the beauty of the suffering. I'm going to take this back into my heart. I'm going to weigh this. I'm not talking about martyrdom. I'm talking about consciously feeling the tension, what is going on, what is happening within us. And it's not about the other person. It's not about the outer situation. It's about the inner and how it makes you feel and how you have the authority to say no to it. That's the only authority you do have. I'm not bringing that in. I'll suffer it consciously. I'll feel it. But it's not a truth. The truth is you're beyond that. So next week we're getting close to, talk about Venus. We are getting closer and closer to St. Valentine's, okay, which that's a wonderful time to start planning a festivity for self-love. So that's it. What I was reading from was Old Age by Helen Luke, a Jungian therapist who has passed on, I think, in 1995, an extraordinary human being. And for those who want to contact me for a private session, 212, I always forget to tell people this, 212-757-8914, or you can go to my webpage, LorraineNeithardt.com, and listen to this podcast, or it can be downloaded on iTunes or at Blog Talk Radio. Sign up and it will be sent to you. So this is going to be an extraordinary month on so many levels, and it is going to give us lots of opportunities to consciously suffer what we no longer need, what we've outgrown. Shoes, if we're living in shoes too small for our feet, it's going to pinch. Let go. Walk barefoot, but honestly. So there, we have it. And next week, I started a little early today. I usually do it at 10. But there's some big things happening, and I got to get to them. All right. Au revoir.
Napa know-how. The Napa guy knows not to judge a man by his car's multicolored paint job or absence of modern gadgetry. Who cares if it's technically old enough to vote and the windows are powered by the strength of your left arm? Your monthly payment is zero, and it'll stay that way. Because with over 500,000 parts and a little Napa know-how, you can keep anything on the road. She may not be pretty, but she's all yours. That's Napa know-how. Napa know-how.